and so forth. In the earlier days, the effects of busing was not to go to a private school as much, because the private schools in Seattle did not grow that much. What grew was the outlying areas. The outlying areas grew much quicker, and so forth. So they just white flight. And it was really not so much white flight, but middle class flight, because you saw Asian American parents moving out too, and so forth. The other issue is that some people wanted to be able to go to a local school, and Seattle did busing. So even though you moved to a certain neighborhood, you had to jump on a bus. And so one of the things that I did when I was on the school board was to have the school do a study of minority students. And were minority students doing better in North End schools, white impacted schools, were they doing better than in minority impacted schools? So we did a study of that, and we found that there was no difference. There was no difference in terms of the academics between students of color in terms of where they were going to school, whether they were going to white impacted schools or going to minority impacted schools. So it didn't matter who you were sitting next to. Just because you're sitting next to a white person doesn't mean you're going to get smarter all of a sudden. And just because you're sitting next to a minority doesn't mean you're going to be dumber. What we saw was that minority students, there was no difference in their academic achievement in a white school or a minority school. And that was the impetus for cutting back on busing. And that was something that I had worked on as the school board chair. And, but the key obstacle at that time was the federal government, to see whether or not they would allow us to do it. Because in those days, the federal government is what had the purse strings of the dollars. And if you tried to make any changes, they would take the money away. So you had to get their approval and do it in such a way. But because we had this data to be able to show that there was no difference, and the difference basically was how good we taught them, the basics really, and whether or not, because some of our students had not the same background, they didn't have all the going through preschool since they were in the third grade, since they were 3 years old, we had to create that and so forth, and have those schools have a richer formula, have them have better child cares. So as we built some of the new schools, we built in child care programs. And we got in local individuals to be able to run them in a way that we could give them a little bit of a head start. So it's not really a head start, but really to catch up to what other parents were able to give their kids automatically. And once again, it became almost not so much a race issue as an economic issue. Because me as an Asian American was able to afford to have my kids start into Montessori very early and so forth. And others just didn't have those resources. So we had to catch up and accelerate that. And the worst thing to do is to bus somebody for an hour and a half each way and so forth. And it's a clear way of not getting involved in anything because they got to catch the bus to get home.
So were you glad when busing ended?
Absolutely. And there's people saying that we resegregated and so forth, and that's not the case at all. The schools were predominantly minority anyway, and so forth. And what was the point of busing here in this area if, in fact, the educational gains were not there? And we needed simply to put the resources where those kids were, and to be able to do it in a way that it's going to have a long-term effect. And you can't continuously say, well, arbitrarily, you move these kids up north, and so you made this school smaller, so therefore, let's close this school, even though most of the kids live in this neighborhood. And you build up a school that's in the north end. That makes no sense whatsoever. So, and that's what busing kind of did in those early days. The other thing is that busing was a national phenomenon in the early days, in the 70s. And, but it was primarily where they were busing. They would have a school in a neighborhood in the south and so forth that was white, and they bussed the local kids out of the area to go to an all-black school and so forth. And that's where they were trying to get rid of some of that. We didn't have that here in Seattle. Ours was a little bit different. And then ours wasn't a black and white or a brown and white issue. Ours was more at the time an Asian, black, white. And this is what some of the other school districts didn't have. And so as and then as our ethnic balance really started to change from, just because you're a black didn't necessarily mean you're African American. It's all these different cultures, and then all these Asian cultures, and all these Latino cultures, and so forth. We started looking at things a little bit different. The school may have 80% minority but it represents 70 different languages. The school district now has, what, almost 100 different languages spoken. So if you walk into a school right now and you see a classroom and you have 30 kids and they're all speaking a different language, they have different cultures, there's something beautiful about that. In the old days, they said that's bad. And so we try to say, no, there's nothing wrong with it. Now, if they're all just one, let's say they're all Chinese Americans and so forth, that's probably not the strongest model. Or if they were all white Americans. But even if you went into a white class and then you saw Eastern Europeans from Russia, from the different cultures, the countries and so forth, the small ones, Kazakhstan and so forth like that, there are, Ukraine, they may all look white, but they're really not white Americans and so forth. There's something beautiful about that because they would be bringing in 10 different languages, 10 different cultures and so forth. It has to be looked at differently, and we weren't looking at it differently. We were looking at a model that was more developed in the East Coast than the South, and so forth. So pulling back on that made sense here in Seattle.